So, we have discussed the presidency in its many faces and its many roles. Chief Executive Order of the Officer of the Executive Branch, Commander-in-Chief of the Military, and Ceremonial Head of State, where the country is personified in certain symbolic moments by the man who occupies the White House, by the man who has been elected President of the United States. There's another moment that happened in Berlin where President Reagan famously said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall," about the same Berlin Wall. Again, America, not just a man, not just President Reagan, America had come to Berlin and had focused the attention of the entire world on this city that is still beleaguered and surrounded at that time by the forces of communism, and that would happily kill anyone who tried crossing the wall in order to be free. Now, what this means is that the presidency in the United States has many similarities to the very king that we got rid of during the American Revolution. How can this be? Well, when the war was won, before the Constitution, before the country had settled itself on how it was going to be governed, Washington was offered the throne to become king of the United States. To which Washington said, "I did not fight against one King George just to become another King George. No, that's ridiculous. We're not going to have a king." So people came to him, people in power, prominent people from around the country, and said, "Well, okay, why don't you become presiding officer, the one who presides, the president, from the Latin praeses, which means he who presides or runs things." And Washington said, "Well, president, it seems Republican Roman. We sort of like that Republican Roman thing. And it's not a king, it's not a royal office. Yeah, sure, president." And then they say, "Yeah, and we want you to be president for life." To which Washington says, no. A king by any other name is still a king. You can call me a president, but if you make me president for life, you're making me your ruler. And I do not want to be your ruler in that way. Nine, nada, no. Just no. Then one of the more crazy offers come his way to become head of the Anglican Church in the United States. The Church of England in the United States had many, many people who were a part of it. But the Church of England no longer was necessarily going to be harmonious with the King of England, who was the head of the church in England. This all has to do with the Protestant Reformation. So there were many, many Americans who worshipped in a church where the King of England had a semi-sacred duty as the head of the church. So they offer Washington the head of a new Church of the United States to take over the old Church of England, where Washington would take the place of the king. To which Washington shook his head and laughed and just wandered off, saying, "You guys are crazy. Come back when you've had some sleep. Drink some coffee. I don't know, do something so that you're not thinking like a crazy person." Finally, they offer Washington the opportunity to run, and nobody's going to run against Washington in 1788, and become the country's first president. And he becomes it, and then he runs for re-election in 1792, and in 1796 he says enough. And John Adams is going to run for president, I think against Thomas Jefferson. Washington leaves power, not because he has to. The man could have been elected for the rest of his life. But being elected president for life is the same thing as being made president for life. He didn't want that. He wanted an American presidency that is a temporary thing, where a person gives up 4 or 8 years of their life to serve their country, and then they go the heck home. Washington is called the American Cincinnatus in many ways, for many reasons, and this is one of them. Like the Roman dictator Cincinnatus, who we talked about earlier in the year, a man who retired, was on his farm, the senators came, said, save us from the barbarians. Cincinnatus said, yeah, okay. Got on his horse, became dictator, took the reins of power, retrained his military, fought the army of the barbarians, beat the army of the barbarians, and the moment that the victory was secure, he said, I'm going home. Bye. That's the best kind of dictator. It's like a guest in your home who knows when to leave before people are going to get sick of him being there. The height of good manners, the old axiom goes, is knowing when to leave. So if you're a guest in someone's home, leave when they still want you around. Don't stay around to such an extent that you're just going to be irritating. Washington leaves after 8 years in office in 2 terms, and he sets a precedent which every American president except one followed. Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940 said, I'm an indispensable man as Europe is involved in World War II, and I need to stay in office. And the Democrat Party agreed with him, and the American people agreed with him. In fact, he not only served 3 terms, he was elected 4 times to the presidency. He died early in his 4th term. Vice President Harry Truman succeeded him. But with the exception of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose excuse was a world war, every American president has been limited to 2 terms. And since Roosevelt, a constitutional amendment was put into place to make sure that that limit was abided, because we didn't want another president for life, which Roosevelt, in effect, was. Franklin Roosevelt, not Teddy Roosevelt. So, in many respects, the president is like a king, because there are times of crisis that require a single person to be the leader, to take responsibility, to make the hard choices, and to see that things happen the way they should. That's the job of any boss. That's the job of any leader. That is the job of the President of the United States. So we have a strong presidency. Now, some presidents are stronger than others. Some presidents, like a lot of presidents in the late 1800s, they didn't believe much in a strong executive. They let Congress do most of the work, and they would occasionally veto things if they didn't like them. But many presidents, especially since World War II, and since all the power that Franklin Roosevelt gathered into the presidency, have viewed the role in a sort of imperial way. The United States is the head of the free world. The United States is the primary global economic linchpin. The United States has an influence worldwide. The United States is the chief bulwark against the forces of communism or Islamism or any number of other problems. And so the American presidency, since the Second World War, has taken on almost a Roman emperor-style role as the leader and protector, not just of the United States, but of the free world. This is not a legal status. It is a status that is, in practical terms, real, because that's the way people behave. So, in some ways, the president is like a king. But in other ways, the president is like a prime minister in a parliamentary democracy, like the parliamentary democracy in Britain. In Britain, we have the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II of the House of Windsor. Queen Elizabeth is the head of state. She is the ceremonial personification of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. She is on the money, her face, because she is the personification of the best in British society. But she has nothing to do, or very little to do, with government. The last time that she did anything definitive was in that Australian matter, and that was with the cooperation of her prime minister. Now, Queen Elizabeth has reigned since the early 1950s, so there have been many prime ministers that have served under her. The prime minister is the leading politician in Britain's House of Commons, which is where everyday citizens serve as elected officials and where everyday citizens vote to determine the fate of the country. In Britain, this House of Commons is where the real power is, and the Prime Minister is the presiding officer of the leading party in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister is not the head of state. The Prime Minister may command the cabinet, but the Prime Minister, along with the other leading politicians within the party in power in Parliament, they come together to command the military. The Prime Minister and the cabinet of leading politicians in the party that runs Parliament ends up running the executive branches of their government. So it's not a single person in Britain that does it. It's what's called the cabinet, which is the Prime Minister and the leading politicians, as I said, within the party in power in Parliament. And these politicians are often given jobs like Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, that sort of thing. Next time, we talk about the other remaining duties of the presidency.